Okay, guys, so we just need to wrap up the very end of Chapter 5. We have some odds and ends here in your last couple slides to piece together. Last time we talked, we discussed carrying capacity, which is the idea of the maximum number of individuals you can support in an area over time. And we said this was determined by limiting factors or limiting resources. And we looked at this with the predator-prey lab. But what we didn't talk about is that there's really two different types of limiting factors, and so we need to cover those still here. The first type is called a density-dependent limiting factor. And so what this means is that the factor depends on the density of organisms that live here. So we actually are dependent upon the number of individuals in an area. So here are 4 different examples of density-dependent limiting factors. The first one is competition. Right? Organisms will compete for resources, as we've talked about, and this competition is going to help determine how many organisms can live in an area, or in other words, what the carrying capacity would be. Now, as individuals, or we add more individuals, we're going to end up with less resources, right? Because everybody's eating stuff, taking up space, whatever it might be. And so we're going to lead toward competition for those resources. And again, that's going to help determine how many organisms can live in a certain place. Second one is very similar. It's just a specific version of competition, which is predation or herbivory, as we've talked about. We said before that the number of predators will help determine the number of prey, and vice versa. And it's a cyclic relationship. So the more predators you have, they'll eat all the prey, but then there won't be as much food, so the predator numbers go down. There won't be as much hunting, so the prey numbers can come back up, and so far and so forth. So it's a cyclic relationship that helps determine the number of both of these groups of individuals. A third one that we've kind of mentioned is parasitism or disease. Right? Diseases can help determine the number of organisms that live in an area. If there's a massive epidemic that wipes out a bunch of organisms, that is a limiting factor. Now, what you notice there is that this is dependent upon density. What it depends upon, though, is the number of bacteria that are causing a disease or the number of parasites that are causing an issue, and that will help determine the number of organisms that are there. Ticks and Lyme disease are an example. This is a picture of someone who has a rash from Lyme disease. We call this a bullseye rash or a target. This is somebody who has Lyme disease, which is actually a bacterial disease that is carried by ticks. So while ticks are a parasite and they suck your blood, they can basically in their saliva transfer into you a bacterium that causes Lyme disease. And so if there's a whole lot of ticks, there's a whole lot of Lyme disease, that could play a role in determining how many other species are there. Lyme disease is actually quite rare in humans, but it's really common in things like deer and other animals that live in the woods that ticks will live on. The fourth one is overcrowding, right? Stress from overcrowding. If there are too many organisms somewhere, there's not enough space, there's not enough probably food and water, so those are a couple resources that become an issue. This weakening of individuals can make your population decrease, and it's all because of the number of individuals that you have, right? Overcrowding too many people. The second type of limiting factor is way simpler, and that's a density-independent limiting factor. This is a factor where the number of individuals involved plays no part at all. And generally, a density-independent limiting factor will cause a population to really crash. It will cause a massive change in the numbers of organisms in a population. All of these density-independent limiting factors are abiotic, and we just kind of lump them into the weather or natural disaster category. So something like a hurricane, a flood, a tornado, wildfires, or earthquakes, these are things that can really change your landscape and really change the number of organisms that live in a place. As you can imagine, if you have a massive wildfire, that's going to decrease the number of plants and animals that live in a given range, and it's going to do so very rapidly. But the number plays no part in this at all, right? So it is totally independent of the density of organisms. It doesn't matter if your population started out with 50 or started out with 50,000. if there's a tornado or there's a hurricane or there's a wildfire, it can change your population a lot. The very last thing that we look at in chapter 5, and actually kind of leads us towards chapter 6, is human population. Right now, the world's population is whatever this thing says it is. There's a website that is run by the Census Bureau of our government that will constantly tell you what the current estimated population is of humans on the entire planet and in the United States. So if you like to go to this website, you can pull up that little calculator, or sometimes we call it a clock, and it'll give you an estimate of the number of individuals that live around here. Our world human population is slowly growing at this point, and that rate of growth has changed over time. Obviously, we had a lot more rapid growth of humans in the past than we do now, but still, we're adding people at a really, really fast pace. If you think about the entire planet, you're having people born basically every second. Now, the study of human populations specifically is called demography, or sometimes we call it demographics. So this is the study of the human population. The first true demographer, or the first person to really study demography, was a guy named Thomas Malthus. And you don't have to know this date, but Thomas Malthus was around a couple hundred years ago, and he suggested that war, famine, and disease would be the things that will limit the human population eventually. So if you think about this, we've already mentioned these limiting factors. War is a type of competition. Right? Famine means you run out of food, so it's a limitation of resources. Disease could involve parasitism. So just a couple slides ago, we looked at those density-dependent limiting factors, and Malthus was just describing these for humans. Now, the major kind of graphical thing that we look at with demographics is age structure. So these were mentioned before when we talked about population dynamics, and you'll also see one of these in that graphing and ecology video and handout. Age structure shows us basically the actual number or the percentage of people who are of a certain age range. So if you look here down this side of these two graphs, you've got the age ranges, and then at the bottom you've got the actual number of people in millions for these that fall into those age ranges. Now, just glancing at an age structure diagram can tell you a couple of things. First thing, obviously, is it tells you the breakdown of those ages, but it also can tell you some things about reproduction, and it can tell you some things about death. Okay? Reproduction is a young person thing, right? The more younger people you have, so the more people kind of in the bottom half of one of these graphs, the more reproduction you're going to get. Death, well, it can occur to any of us at any time, tends to be more of an old person thing. So the more people you have on the upper half of your graph, the more death you're probably going to have. Now, what this allows us to do is make a determination about population growth. So, for instance, if we look at the United States has a fairly even graph here. You got a lot of young people, you got a lot of middle-aged people, and you got a lot of old people. Now, obviously, it still tapers here at the top, but for the most part, you got a lot of people, and you've got a lot of people above this line. Now, this means that death is fairly high in the United States, but so is reproduction in the United States. So death kind of high, birth kind of high. Now, what this means is that we have a somewhat stable population. Now, as it says over here, we are a slow-growing population. Because we have a lot of young people, and because it does still taper here at the top, we do have growth, but we have slow growth in the United States of our population. Now, in a lot of other countries, especially countries that are a little bit less developed than ours, they will have an age structure diagram that looks like this one from Guatemala, where you see way more people down here who are young compared to those that are old. If an age structure diagram tapers to a really sharp point, like this Guatemalan one does, that is fast growth. Okay, these populations that have these sharp pointed age structure diagrams are very quickly growing. And it's because they have more young people, so more reproduction. Less old people, less death. Now, the only other thing that I want you to look at here is to notice, I'm going to erase a little bit of this stuff. Notice that an age structure diagram is usually broken into males and females. So, on one side, I've got the males, and on the other side, I've got the females. That means, as you can see here, this graph is split down the middle, so notice how your data works as well. The data point of 0 is in the middle, and it counts out from either way. So, for instance, I could ask you how many boys are in the ages of 0 to 4 for the United States. And you would say 0 here out to almost 10, so you'd say about 10 million boys. I could also ask you how many girls are age 1 to 4 in the United States. And you would go 0 here out to more like 9.5. So you'd say 9.5 million girls. Or I could ask you how many kids total are between ages 0 and 4. In this case, you are going to have to add both together, right? All the boys and all the girls. So you would say about 10 million boys plus 9.5 million girls would be about 19.5 million people are between the ages of 0 and 4. So just keep in mind that this graph really has two sides to it. Okay, last one. Last slide took a long time. This is a rough graph. It's a little bit dated now, but a rough graph of human population growth. Notice that for a long time, talking about thousands of years, we were, not a big population, but it was changes in our society that sort of allows our population to increase. We have agriculture, a more organized way to get a consistent food source. That's going to allow us to start having more people because we have more resources. We have improvements to our ability to farm, which again improves the amount of resources we have in terms of food and increases our numbers. Notice here in the 1340s, we had started to go up, but then we see a dip. This is from the plague, right? You've maybe learned a little bit about the plague in the past. You'll learn more about it in your history classes and English classes usually too. But essentially, the plague wiped out something like 3/4 of the humans in Europe, and it was all brought there by a mouse. It's a bacterial infection that just killed people very quickly, and so that sort of epidemic of disease, as we talked about a moment ago, being a limiting factor, really dropped the human population. Since then, we've had massive increase, and it's mostly due to this industrial revolution. Right? We've improved our ability to mass produce foods and get them to people. We've improved our sanitation, so I have this toilet on the slide, which means we have less disease from unsanitary conditions. We've also improved medicine. Here's Dr. McDreamy. An improvement in medicine means that we can keep people alive longer, and so we've seen a massive increase in the human population over the last couple hundred years. Now today, this graph is still climbing, but it's slowing down. They said we're slowly growing now, and eventually we're probably going to reach our carrying capacity. So eventually we're going to reach a point where we can't have any more people on this planet. I doubt that's going to be in your lifetime, but it's sort of around the corner. So that takes care of chapters 4 and 5. I know it's a lot of information. We will review next class and go through a whole bunch of stuff together. Take care.